The music swirled around her like a taunt, but Lady Lydia Stanwyck stood motionless, a glass of champagne warming in her hand. Across the ballroom, her husband, the Duke of Stanwyck, was dancing with Lady Cordelia Ashby, his gloved hand resting with perfect ease against the small of Cordelia's back. He leaned down, murmured something, and Cordelia's silvery laugh drifted across the polished floor. Lydia did not move. She had learned over 5 long years how to stand so still that she became invisible, how to arrange her face so that the pain did not show, how to breathe through the ache that had settled so deeply into her chest she sometimes forgot it was not an actual part of her bones. Not one person approached her. They did not dare. To be seen speaking warmly to the wife the Duke ignored was a social risk most guests were not willing to take. The whispers had become so familiar they had lost their sting, though a dull, bruised echo remained. Poor thing, married for his revenge, you know. Her father swindled the old Duke. Can you imagine the humiliation? He won't even look at her. 5 years of this. Lydia's fingers tightened on the stem of the glass. 5 years. Yes. That was how long she had woken in the great cold house that was not a home, walked its echoing corridors alone, and waited for a love that had never arrived. 5 years of trying to earn a kindness that was never offered. 5 years of hoping that today, perhaps today, he would see her. But Alexander Stanwyck had never seen her. He had married her to settle a debt of anger, a debt of shame. The details were a blade she had been handed on her wedding night and had held against her own heart ever since. Her father, a merchant with ambitions too large for his station, had been accused of swindling the late Duke out of a fortune. The scandal had broken the old Duke's health. He had died a ruined man, and young Alexander, barely 23, had inherited a title drenched in disgrace. It had taken him a decade to claw back his name, his estate, his pride. And when he was powerful enough, he had chosen his final act of vengeance. He had acquired a legal debt that belonged to Lydia's family, a promissory note that could not be paid. The only payment he would accept was her hand in marriage. He had looked at her on their wedding day, not with a bridegroom's hope, but with the cold satisfaction of a man collecting a debt. "You will be the Duchess of Stanwyck," he had said, his voice without a single note of warmth. "You will conduct yourself with dignity. You will not bring further shame to my name, and you will ask nothing of me beyond what duty demands." She had nodded, her throat too tight for speech, and had loved him desperately and hopelessly from that very first moment. That had been her secret, silent tragedy. Now across the ballroom the dance ended. Alexander escorted Lady Cordelia back to her circle with a polite bow. As he turned, his gaze swept the room and passed over Lydia without pause, as if she were a coat stand, a piece of furniture, less than a stranger. The fragile glass in her hand cracked, a thin line splintered from rim to base. She set it carefully on a passing tray and excused herself, walking with slow, measured steps toward the terrace. No one stopped her, no one noticed. The night air was cool and sharp, and Lydia stood alone on the stone balcony looking out over the moonlit gardens. The ache in her chest throbbed. Something had shifted inside her tonight, something quiet and final. She was so very tired, tired of waiting, tired of hopping, tired of loving a man who would never love her back. A single tear traced a cold path down her cheek. She wiped it away before it could fall. No more, she told herself, no more. That night back at Stanwyck Hall, the vast ancestral seat that felt more like a mausoleum, Lydia did not wait up for him. She did not sit in the small sitting room she had decorated with soft colors in a vain attempt to make some corner of the house feel like a home. She did not listen for his footsteps in the corridor. She went directly to her bedchamber, closed the door, and sat before the looking-glass. The woman who stared back at her was beautiful, though the beauty had grown too thin, too pale. Dark hair, worn simply. Eyes that had once been bright with nervous hope, now guarded. She was 24 years old and she felt 100. She unpinned her hair slowly, letting it fall, and spoke aloud to the empty room. I release you. She was not speaking to Alexander. She was speaking to herself. She was releasing the version of herself that had woken every morning hopping for a smile, a kind word, a glance that lingered. That woman was exhausted. That woman had bled out drop by drop in a marriage that was never truly a marriage. That woman was done. From this night forward, Lydia Stanwyck would stop asking for love. She would stop trying to earn affection. She would do her duty as she had promised, but she would no longer break her heart against the stone wall of his indifference. She climbed into the great empty bed, pulled the covers up to her chin, and for the first time in 5 years, she did not cry herself to sleep. She simply closed her eyes and let the silence carry her away. The following morning, the change was invisible to everyone but Lydia herself. She rose early, dressed in a gown of soft gray wool, and went down to the breakfast room. Alexander was already there, reading the paper, a cup of black coffee at his elbow. He did not look up when she entered. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said quietly, taking her seat at the far end of the long table. He gave the faintest nod, that was all. In the past, she would have tried. She would have asked about his plans, commented on the weather, offered to pour his tea. 100 small overtures designed to crack the ice, all of which had been met with monosyllables or silence. This morning she asked nothing. She buttered her toast with steady hands and ate in quiet peace. A small part of her was waiting for the familiar pain to rise. It did not come. Instead, there was only a hollow sort of calm. It was not happiness, but it was not agony either. It was rest. After breakfast, she went to the morning room where she met with Mrs. Godwin, the housekeeper, a kind woman who had been with the family for decades and was one of the few people in the house who treated Lydia with genuine warmth. Mrs. Godwin had watched the young Duchess's slow erosion with quiet sympathy, too loyal to speak against the master but too good-hearted not to offer what small comforts she could. "I should like to become more useful, Mrs. Godwin," Lydia said, smoothing her skirt. "I have been idle too long. Is there charitable work on the estate that requires attention? The tenants, perhaps. The village." Mrs. Godwin's worn face brightened. "There is always need, Your Grace. The orphanage in Hartley Village, for one. It's been struggling since the winter fever, and several tenant families could use a visit. The old dowager used to do such things, but since she passed, the house has not had a lady willing to take it up." "I am willing," Lydia said, and the words felt like the first solid ground she had stood on in years. So she began. She did not ask Alexander's permission. She had learned long ago that he paid so little attention to her that he rarely noticed if she left the grounds, so long as she was present for formal dinners and did nothing to embarrass the Stanwyck name. She took a small carriage to the village, accompanied only by a maid, and visited the orphanage. The children were thin and the building drafty, but the matron, Mrs. Bell, was a woman of fierce determination. Lydia did not just offer polite sympathy. She asked practical questions, examined ledgers, and quietly dipped into her own pin money to order firewood, wool blankets, and a fresh supply of medicines. Word spread. Within a fortnight, the tenants began to speak of the young Duchess with something warmer than respectful duty. They called her the quiet lady, and they noticed that when she visited, she did not stand apart like a grand noblewoman. She sat in their cramped kitchens, held their bobbies, listened to their worries, and remembered their names. The local physician, a gentle man named Dr. Elias Hart, began to accompany her on her rounds, assisting with the sick. He was a serious, soft-spoken man with sandy hair and kind eyes, and he treated Lydia not as a walking scandal but as an equal. Their conversations were easy, full of small laughters and shared purpose. It was a kind of companionship she had never known. Alexander noticed nothing at first. He was occupied with Parliament and estate business, and his wife's daily movements were of such little interest to him that weeks passed before he remarked on her frequent absences from the house. Even then, it was only a brief, distracted query at dinner one evening. "You have been out quite often." Lydia, cutting her roasted chicken into small bites, replied evenly, "Yes, I have been attending to the orphanage and visiting tenants." He looked at her then, a slight frown creasing his brow. Something in her tone was different. It was not cold, not defiant. It was simply composed. She was not seeking his approval. She was reporting a fact. "I see," he said slowly. He seemed about to add something, perhaps a warning not to exhaust the household funds or to be mindful of her reputation, but he stopped. There was something unfamiliar in her posture, a quiet self-possession that had not been there before. It unsettled him, though he could not say why. "The work is quite rewarding," Lydia continued, reaching for her water glass. "The children were in desperate need. I have arranged for better food and blankets, and Dr. Hart has been most helpful in treating the cases of fever." "Dr. Hart," Alexander's voice sharpened just a fraction. "The physician in the village, a very capable man." She said it with simple, open appreciation. No hidden flirtation, no coyness, which somehow made it worse. Alexander set down his fork. "You have been spending a great deal of time with this physician." Lydia met his eyes. "I have been spending a great deal of time with the poor. Dr. Hart is often there, tending to the same needs. It would be strange if we did not speak." There was a beat of silence. The Duke's jaw tightened, but he did not press. He was not entitled to press, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that he had no right to feel the small, hot spark kindling in his chest. He ignored it, as he had ignored so many uncomfortable feelings where his wife was concerned. He changed the subject to estate drainage, and the meal continued in the same brittle quiet. But that night, as he sat alone in his study with a glass of brandy, Alexander could not concentrate on the papers before him. He kept seeing his wife's face as she had said that name, Dr. Hart, a very capable man. There had been a softness in her voice, a warmth, something he had never in 5 years heard her use when speaking of him. He told himself it was irritation. His wife was a Stanwyck now, and she should not be overly familiar with village physicians. It was a matter of propriety. That was all. The weeks passed, and the change in Lydia deepened. She no longer watched him at dinner with those wide, hopeful eyes. She did not linger in the corridor outside his study, hopping for a moment of conversation. She did not arrange her hair in the style she had once thought he might prefer. Instead, she moved through Stanwyck Hall like a quiet ghost of purpose, her days full of her charity work, and her evenings spent reading in her own sitting room. The light that had once burned so desperately in her had banked into a steady, self-contained flame. And Alexander, without understanding why, began to feel the absence of that desperate light like a cold draft in his own house. One afternoon, he returned early from a business journey and decided to ride through the village. As he passed the orphanage, he saw his wife standing in the courtyard with Dr. Hart. She was laughing at something the physician said, her head tilted, a smudge of dust on her cheek. She looked younger, brighter, more alive than Alexander had ever seen her within the walls of his own home. Dr. Hart was looking at her with an expression that any man would recognize: admiration, respect, and something deeper, something quiet and patient that spoke of real affection. The spark in Alexander's chest ignited into something hotter, something that made his hands tighten on the reins. He did not stop. He did not call out. He simply turned his horse and rode back to Stanwyck Hall, his mood blacker than a winter storm. That evening, he confronted her in the library, where she was cataloging old books, a task she had taken on to improve the estate's records. "I saw you," he said, closing the door behind him with a sharp click. "With that physician, you seemed very comfortable." Lydia turned from the shelves, a ledger in her hands. Her expression was calm, though her pulse quickened. "We were distributing blankets to the children. It was a pleasant afternoon. He looked at you as if you were more than a duchess to him." She set the ledger down carefully. "Dr. Hart is my friend, the only one I have made in this county since my husband has ensured that society will never accept me. He treats me with kindness. I did not realize that was a crime." The words, delivered without heat, struck Alexander harder than any shouted accusation could have done. He stood very still, his chest rising and falling with a breath that felt too shallow. "You are my wife," he said, his voice low and rough. "Yes," Lydia said, "I am your wife. I have always been your wife. And until now, Your Grace, you have never once seemed to care what I did, so long as I was quiet and invisible, so I became invisible. I did exactly what you wanted. Why then are you angry?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable, because he did not know, because he had spent 5 years burying every soft feeling beneath layers of cold duty and old resentment, and now the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He had wanted a silent, obedient wife to pay a debt. He had never expected her to stop loving him. He had never, in his arrogance, imagined that her love was something he could lose. He turned on his heel and left the room without another word, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. That night Lydia did not cry. She sat in the window seat of her bedchamber, looking out at the silvered lawn, and felt a strange, sad sense of triumph. She had finally spoken the truth. She had stopped begging, and though her heart still ached, the dignity of it was something new, something precious. Alexander did not sleep. He paced his study, pouring brandy he did not drink, his mind a chaos of images. Lydia's patient smile, Lydia's quiet hands, Lydia on their wedding day trembling like a leaf, looking up at him with such desperate hope. He had crushed that hope under his heel, and he had done it deliberately. He had told himself it was justice. His father had died in shame because of her family. He had rebuilt everything from ashes. He was entitled to his revenge. But revenge had grown cold. The woman he had punished had never been the one who hurt him. She had been 17 when they married, a girl whose only crime was bearing the name of a man Alexander hated. And she had tried. God, how she had tried. He remembered the small gestures, the flowers she had placed in his study, the books she had left on his desk with passages she thought he might enjoy, the way she had learned his preferences and quietly arranged the household around them. He had accepted her efforts like a king receiving tribute, and he had given her nothing in return. Now she had stopped. Now she was giving her warmth to orphaned children and a soft-eyed physician who looked at her as though she were the sun itself, and Alexander was left in the cold of his own making. The first crack in his armor came a week later, when he received an unexpected visit from his solicitor, Mr. Briggs. The man came with ledgers and a grave expression, asking to speak privately about the estate's accounts. "Your Grace," Briggs said, spreading papers on the desk, "there is a matter of some irregularity. A series of payments made over the last 2 years, credited to Stanwick Hall's debt accounts. They amount to a considerable sum. The funds came from an external source. I traced them to a London jeweler." Alexander frowned. "What payments? I authorized no such thing." "No, Your Grace. The payments were made on your behalf anonymously. The jeweler, however, confirmed that the items sold were a collection of pearls, the Dowager Duchess's pearls, unless I am mistaken. They were sold piece by piece." The Duke's blood went cold. His mother's pearls, the ones he had left in the family vault and had not thought to inspect in years. They had been part of the dowry of the late Duchess, his grandmother. He had not even realized they were missing. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew. "The sale was arranged by Her Grace, the Duchess. She sold the pearls quietly through a maid to avoid attention. The proceeds were used to pay off the lingering debts from the old scandal, debts you had been struggling to clear, sir. She has been doing this for 2 years, piece by piece. The last remaining necklace was sold only last month." The room swam. Alexander sat down slowly, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. The pearls, Lydia's only valuable possession, the only legacy of a family that had left her nothing but shame. She had sold them silently to lift his burden. And he had not known, he had not even noticed. When he found his voice, it was hoarse. "Leave the papers, and say nothing of this to anyone." After the solicitor left, Alexander sat alone for a long time, staring at the documents but seeing nothing. The evidence of her sacrifice was laid out in neat columns of figures. She had been quietly paying for his pride, and he had been ignoring her, dismissing her, leaving her so starved for affection that she had sought simple friendship with a village doctor. He thought of her laughing in the courtyard, and the image now pierced him with a new, unbearable sharpness. She had given him everything, and he had thrown it away. That evening he sought her out. She was in the small conservatory, tending to a pot of white roses she had coaxed back to life after years of neglect. She did not hear him enter, and for a moment he simply stood in the doorway, watching her hands move gently among the leaves. She looked so peaceful, so entirely separate from him. The distance between them had never felt more vast. "Lydia." She looked up, startled. He rarely used her given name. She waited, a smudge of soil on her apron, her expression guarded. "I have just learned about the pearls," he said, his voice rough. "You sold your mother's pearls to pay my debts." She went still, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. "Who told you?" "It does not matter. Is it true?" She set down the small trowel and wiped her hands on a cloth. "Yes." "Why?" The word broke from him, raw and desperate. "Why would you do that, after the way I have treated you, after everything?" Lydia looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes held a sadness so deep it made his chest ache. "Because I loved you," she said simply, in the past tense. "And because it was the only thing I could do. You would not accept my affection, so I gave you the only gift I had, anonymously, because I knew if you discovered it, your pride would not allow you to keep it." He took a step toward her, his heart hammering. "Lydia." She held up a hand, stopping him. "Please, do not say anything you do not mean. I did not do it to earn your gratitude. I did it because I could not bear to watch you struggle under a weight that was not entirely yours to carry." "Not entirely mine," he frowned. "Your father swindled my family. The weight is his doing." Her expression flickered. For the first time he saw something beyond sadness. He saw a terrible, guarded knowledge. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice sharpening. "What are you not telling me?" Lydia turned away, her hands trembling slightly as she fussed with the roses. "Nothing that matters now." "It matters to me. Tell me." She drew a shaky breath. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father did not swindle yours, Alexander. I found the letters 3 years ago, hidden in an old chest that belonged to my mother. The true culprit was your uncle, Lord Percival. He forged my father's name on the documents and fled to the continent with the money. My father was his business partner, and he took the blame to shield my mother from the scandal of a public trial. He died with everyone believing him a thief, so that she could live with some small shred of peace." The words fell like stones into a silent pool. Alexander stared at her, his mind reeling. "That cannot be true." "It is true." Lydia finally met his eyes, and he saw the tears she was holding back with fierce control. "I have the letters. I have kept them hidden because I could not bear to destroy the memory of the one family member you still honored. Your uncle was a villain, but you loved him. You had lost so much already. I thought if you knew, it would break something in you that could not be mended. So I stayed silent. I let you hate me. I thought it was better than letting you hate your own blood." The room spun. Alexander gripped the back of a chair for support. Uncle Percival, the charming, laughing uncle who had taught him to ride and shoot, who had comforted him after his father's death. The man he had idolized. A thief, a forger, the true destroyer of his family. And this woman, this quiet, patient woman whom he had punished for 5 years, had known. She had carried the truth like a stone in her heart, protecting him from the ugliness of it. "You should have told me," he said, his voice breaking. "Would you have believed me?" she asked, and the question was not accusatory. It was simply weary. "You never once listened to me, Alexander, not once. Why would you have believed me about this?" The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. He had never listened. He had never given her a chance. Every kindness she had offered, every gesture of love, he had met with ice. And all the while, she had been shielding him from a devastation that would have shattered his entire identity. He stepped forward, his legs unsteady, and before she could retreat, he dropped to his knees before her. The proud Duke of Stanwick on his knees on the conservatory floor, his hands reaching for hers. Lydia, her name was a prayer, a plea. I am so sorry. I have been blind, cruel. I have wasted 5 years that I can never get back. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve your protection. But I am begging you, please do not leave me. Do not give up on me now. She looked down at him, her face a mosaic of pain and hope and long-suppressed sorrow. The tears she had held back for so long spilled over at last, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. I stopped hopping, Alexander. I had to. Hope was destroying me. I don't know if I can find it again. Then let me find it for you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Let me earn it. Give me a chance to be the husband you deserved from the start. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I am asking, please. For a long, trembling moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, her fingers curled around his. The touch was light, tentative, as fragile as a new leaf in spring. But it was a touch. It was a beginning. I don't know if I can trust you, she whispered. I want to, but I am afraid. I know. He pressed her fingers to his lips, his eyes closing against the sting of his own tears. I will spend the rest of my life proving myself. I will wait as long as you need. Just stay. The conservatory was quiet around them, the scent of roses hanging in the air. Outside, the evening light was fading into a gentle twilight, the first stars beginning to appear. And for the first time in 5 years, the silence between the Duke and Duchess of Stanwick was not a void. It was a bridge. In the weeks that followed, Alexander began his slow, careful campaign of mending. He did not push. He did not demand. He simply showed up. Each morning he asked after her plans and he listened, really listened to her answers. He began to join her on her visits to the village, standing quietly in the background while she spoke with tenants, carrying baskets of food, and earning the skeptical glances of the people who had learned to love the Duchess far more than they respected the Duke. He wrote to Dr. Elias Hart and thanked him with stiff but genuine politeness for the kindness he had shown his wife. He did not make a scene. He did not forbid further friendship. He simply acknowledged that another man had given Lydia what he had withheld, and he was grateful rather than threatened. It was perhaps the hardest thing he had ever done, but he did it. And Lydia watched him. She watched the proud Duke humbling himself before a farmer's widow, lifting a sack of grain. She watched him sitting awkwardly on the floor of the orphanage, letting a small girl place a paper crown on his head. She watched him struggling to find the right words, failing often but trying, always trying. Slowly the frozen ground of her heart began to thaw, not all at once. There were setbacks. There were nights when she lay awake, gripped by the fear that this was all a performance, that the ice would return. There were moments when she caught herself pulling away, building walls against future hurt. But Alexander would not let the walls stand. He was patient and he was persistent, and his eyes held a sorrowful tenderness that had never been there before. One evening, 3 months after his confession, they sat together on the terrace of Stanwick Hall, watching the sun sink below the tree line. The air was soft and warm, and the roses she had tended were blooming in a riot of white and pink. I have been thinking, Lydia said, her voice quiet, about the pearls. He turned to her, his expression attentive. I will buy them back, every last one. I have already begun tracing them. That is not what I meant. She looked at him, and there was something new in her gaze, something that looked almost like peace. I do not want them back. They belong to a time when we were strangers living in the same house. I would rather have a new beginning than old pearls. His breath caught. He reached for her hand, cradling it gently in both of his. What kind of new beginning? She smiled, a real smile, small and tentative but genuine. I think, she said, that I am ready to hope again, just a little. The words were a gift he did not deserve, and he knew it. He lifted her hand to his cheek and held it there, his eyes closing. I love you, Lydia. I think I have loved you for a very long time, but I was too proud and too stupid to see it. I will say it every day if you will let me. I will say it until you are tired of hearing it, and then I will say it some more." A tear slipped down her face, but it was not a tear of sorrow, it was a tear of release. "I love you too," she whispered. "I never stopped. I just hid it so well that even I forgot it was there." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently to hers. They stayed like that, breathing the same air, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. The house behind them, once so cold and cavernous, felt smaller now, warmer, filled with the quiet music of two hearts finally beating in rhythm. In the weeks after, they began to build a life that was entirely their own. They redecorated the East Wing together, choosing colors that made them both smile. They hosted small dinners for the tenants, and Lydia's laughter became a familiar sound in the halls. Alexander learned to bring her tea in the morning, and she learned to tease him gently about his terrible skill at flower arranging. The scars of the past did not vanish, but they softened, becoming part of the story rather than its ending. One afternoon, walking through the village, they passed the orphanage where the children were playing in the yard, healthy and warm. Dr. Hart was there too, chatting with the matron. He looked up and met Alexander's eyes. There was no challenge, no resentment. The physician simply nodded with quiet respect, and Alexander returned the nod. Then Elias turned to Lydia and smiled. "Your Grace," he said to her, with the ease of an old friend, "the new blankets arrived. The children wanted to write a letter of thanks." "I would love to receive it," Lydia said, her hand resting in the crook of Alexander's arm. As they walked on, Alexander was quiet for a moment, then said, "He's a good man." "Yes, he is," Lydia agreed. "He was a good friend to me when I had none." Alexander stopped and turned to face her, his expression earnest. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a better friend to you than he was, a better husband, a better partner." She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers gentle. "You already are," she said simply. "Because you are here, and you are trying, that is all I ever wanted." He kissed her then, softly, in the middle of the village lane, not caring who saw. And the villagers, who had once whispered about the cold Duke and his invisible wife, now smiled and looked away politely, allowing them their private moment of healing. The seasons turned. Winter melted into spring, and spring blossomed into a summer that seemed to hold more light than any Lydia could remember. She was no longer the invisible Duchess. She was the heart of Stanwick Hall, and the love she had once given in silence was now returned to her 100-fold. And every night before they slept, Alexander would take her hand and say the words that had been so long denied. "I love you, Lydia. Thank you for waiting for me." And every night she would smile and answer, "I would wait a lifetime if it brought me here." They had found each other in the ruins of an arranged marriage, in the ashes of old resentments and painful sacrifices, and they had built something new, something warm, something that would last beyond all the cold years that had come before. In the end, it was not a grand gesture that saved them. It was the quiet courage of a woman who stopped begging and started living, and the slow awakening of a man who finally learned to see the treasure that had been beside him all along. Their love was not a sudden fire. It was a dawn, slow, steady, and bright enough to chase away the longest night.